And thank you for the opportunity to present here at the Shevchenko Scientific Society. As you know, women played a prominent role in protests held in Ukraine from November 2013 to February 2014. And in my today's talk, I'm going to discuss some findings from a project that I completed with Maria de Casper, then an undergraduate student at Fordham University. And the findings from this project would appear in the fall issue of Slavic Review in November 2018. So if anybody is interested to learn more about this project, you can pick up a copy of the journal and read an article. So I just want to very briefly provide some background for the national context in which this activism took place, and anti-government protests broke out in November 2013 in response to the incumbent president's refusal to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union, but they rapidly grew into a larger protest campaign that encompassed a wide range of issues and attracted a cross-cutting coalition of citizens with different ideological preferences, but a shared distaste for the current regime. And a lot of scholars distinguish three phases during the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity. So during the first phase, lasting for a few days in November 2013, a large number of students, university students in particular, participated in anti-government protests. And then in response to police violence and public outrage of it, the size of anti-government protests has significantly swelled. So from December 1st to January 15 approximately, you know, some scholars label this period as Maidan Tabir, because it was marked by a growth of encampment on Maidan, Kiev's main square, and the construction of barricades. The police violence escalated in January 2014, and the third phase of the Euromaidan was the most violent, and it ended in, eventually with the flee of the incumbent president and new presidential elections. So protesters demanded closer ties with the European Union and the resignation of the incumbent government, but also they wanted to see genuine political reforms in Ukraine, and in particular greater respect for human rights and human dignity, and that's how these events got its term. Numerous public opinion polls indicate that the middle class and in particular young professionals constituted a large share of protesters. Vladimir Paniot estimated that as many as 64% of protesters had higher education, and an additional 12% were university students. And women, of course, also, you know, made up a larger share of participants in the Euromaidan protests. The Democratic Initiatives Foundation and the Kiev International Institute of Sociology conducted several on-site surveys during this period. The first one was done in early December 2013, then in mid-December, and in early February. So as you can see from this graph, the share of women inside the encampment on the Maidan has significantly declined from 42% in early December 2013 to as few as 12% by February 2014. A lot of women actually challenge these statistics and they claim that they have remained actively engaged in the Euromaidan, even though their presence on the barricades was not as evident. And in fact, women performed a variety of functions during the Euromaidan, and some of them provided first aid and food, carrying out some traditional duties, social care work, but others coordinated an extensive network of volunteers, executed crowdsourcing initiatives to solicit critical resources for the revolutionary cause. And women also produced pieces of art and various material to uplift the spirit of protest. So, for example, on this slide you can see a copy of the poster that was produced during the time. There was a whole series of them where they were bilingual, and they tried to visually convey what Euromaidan stood for and why people came to protest against the government. So women played a critical role during this revolution, and without them I think it would not have been possible to sustain contentious collective action for 3 months. So the research question that I pose in this project is, why did women participate in revolution, and more specifically, what motivated women to get involved in high-risk activism? So in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to just briefly discuss prior research on women and contentious politics. Then I'll examine gender inequality in Ukraine prior to the Revolution of Dignity, and then present my findings. And in conclusion, we can briefly maybe discuss gender outcomes of the revolution, whether anything has changed in the wake of this wave of civic activism. The role of women has long been neglected in comparative politics literature, and in 1994, for example, the British scholar Georgina Whelan published a widely cited article in World Politics, in which she deplored gender-blind research in comparative democratization literature. And the similar trend was observed in sociology, in research focusing on revolutions and post-revolutionary transformations around the globe. But in recent years, there is a growing amount of research on women and protests, and a common identity of women is often identified as political outsiders. And another common feature in this body of literature is that oftentimes motherhood provides an incentive for women to protest, because mothers tend to be concerned about the well-being of their biological children, and it serves an incentive for them to take political action. And by extension, Nancy Naples developed the concept of activist mothering to suggest that women's concern about the well-being of their biological children will translate into their broader concern for the community as a whole. And she demonstrated it by looking at women's engagement in community service in New York City and Philadelphia. There is a specifically growing amount of research on women's civic activism in contemporary Ukraine. In recent years, we have seen an increasing amount of attention devoted to women's engagement in underground resistance to the communist regime in the 1940s and the 1950s. Several historians, including Alisa Khomyachuk and Kies, for example, published research on women's involvement in UNUPA, and they in particular investigated how women tried to contest the traditional gender norms, but at the same time they were forced to subordinate their personal lives to the national cause. And also there was some work done on women's involvement in ruch and жіноча громада, although I haven't found a lot of articles published in English on this topic, with a notable exception maybe of Соломія Павличка. And there is a booming research on women's role during the transition from communism. Alexandra Hrytsak, for example, has conducted extensive research on women's NGOs and the interactions between Ukrainian NGOs and the transnational feminist networks, how they try to navigate the new space and reinterpret the notion of feminism. In 2004, when the Orange Revolution broke out, a lot of women participated in the post-election protests, but maybe because they did not try to raise their feminist voice as strongly as during the Revolution of Dignity, or maybe because the revolution was not as violent, women as a social actor did not attract a great deal of scholarly attention. So with the exception of Hrytsak, there was hardly anything published on the role of women during the Orange Revolution. And in the post-Orange Revolution period, a lot of attention has been drawn to the acts performed by the feminist group Femen. It was they adopted a very controversial approach to protesting by using naked body as a form of protest. And now, in the aftermath of the Euromaidan, voluminous literature has been produced to try and document citizens' engagement in these revolutionary events. I'm sure you are familiar with most of these books. 94 Days Through the Eyes of TSN, news service of the channel 1+1, was produced to narrate these events through the eyes of journalists. And another journalist, Sonia Koshkina, provided her own account of the Maidan to challenge a media bias in the portrayal of revolutionaries, the over-reporting of men standing on the barricades and women fixing sandwiches in the kitchens. Irina Virtoso, with the support from the Ukrainian Women's Fund, produced a book called Жіноча справа, and you can actually download it for free from the website of Ukrainian Women's Fund, uwf.org.ua. Virtoso conducted interviews with 17 protesters, women protesters, and told their story to demonstrate how women contributed to the Euromaidan. Kristina Berdinsky did a series of reports on women and men who participated in the revolution, and initially she posted it on Facebook, and then she published a book based upon it. Another notable publication on the topic was produced by Oksana Zabushka, a well-known Ukrainian writer and poet who co-edited an anthology of social media postings on the topic. And Maidan Switching was a very detailed, very thorough analysis of the events through the eyes of protesters, and in particular Ukrainian Jews, and it was produced by a team of historians at the Kyiv Mahila Academy. So if anybody is interested, I strongly recommend you to read these books. But with the exception of Virtuoso, most of them don't place women at the center of their analysis, and even despite the fact that there has been a flurry of articles looking specifically at women's role during the Maidan, I think that there is still a lot of room for further research, and women merit attention in the context of Ukrainian Revolution and in the post-revolutionary period. Women constitute approximately half of Ukraine's population. Actually, there are slightly more men than women, according to the 2014 data. There are 54% of women in Ukraine. On average, women live 10 years longer. You know, the average life expectancy for women is 76 and 66 for men. But still, numerous organizations, international and local, indicate that women face a great deal of inequality in contemporary Ukraine. According to the Gender Inequality Index compiled by UNDP, Ukraine was ranked 57 out of 188 countries. And similarly, the Global Gender Gap Index placed Ukraine at number 56 out of 142. You know, at the top of the list, obviously, were Scandinavian countries, where the level of gender inequality is the lowest. So women, in particular in Ukraine, on average had a higher level of education than men, but they faced greater barriers to participation in the labor market and discrimination in the workplace. So just to illustrate it, I looked up the statistics average monthly wages in 2013, and hopefully you can see there are a lot of numbers here, but you know, there is one column here like female year, and then male year, and well, actually, if you go back, well, it's okay. Well, if yeah, I mean, they have different sectors of the economy, and of course, you know, I think that, for example, in general, women in Ukraine receive 77 cents for every dollar earned by men. But for some sectors, like for example, for financial insurance activities, you can see that the gap is even wider. So for example, women receive like 5,000 over there, and men like around 8,000 hryvnias per month. In general, for women, the average monthly wages in 2013 was $362. And for men, it was 469. So women had less access to economic resources, and of course, it put them at a disadvantage in the political sphere. So again, you know, Ukrainian Women's Fund has really funded a lot of research on the topic and plays a prominent role in Ukrainian NGO community. So in 2010, they produced the gender mass of power, гендерная арифметика влады. So they, throughout the post-Soviet period, women held less than 10% of seats in the Verkhovna Rada. The representation of women was slightly higher in lower level city councils or oblast level councils, but still I think it's quite clear that women were not as well represented as they should have. And against this backdrop, you know, women still tried to influence domestic politics and push for political change during the Euromaidan. In the study that I completed with Maria de Casper, we conducted interviews with 37 women protesters. It was a small sample, but it's quite common in qualitative research. We interviewed women between the ages of 16 and 71 with the average of 30. As you can see in this table, the larger, more than half of respondents in our sample were aged 29 or younger, and a lot of them had a higher education or were university students. And for comparison, I also listed the composition, the socio-demographic composition of women protesters who were present on the Maidan at the time when the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology and the Democratic Initiatives Foundation conducted their survey. So you can see that in our sample we don't have any women who came out of town to participate in protests in Kyiv, but overall, you know, what KIS and D found out was that approximately 1/3 of women who participated in anti-government protests did travel from other parts of the country to be present on the Maidan. So why did women join protests? Why did they protest? Our findings indicate that there were a host of different motivations for protesting, maybe because a lot of people in our sample were quite young, under the age of 30, so motherhood did not loom large in their thinking yet, and some of them were not mothers themselves. So relatively few of them, less than 1/3, brought up the notion of motherhood. So just as an illustration, one of the women said, "Women are first and foremost mothers, and it is important to us which kind of country our children will live in." So it was one of the, this responded Melania, you know, invoked this notion of motherhood to explain why she got involved in protest. But actually the most dominant incentive for women's engagement in protest activity was profound dissatisfaction with the incumbent government, and in particular rampant corruption within the ruling elite. So Yaroslava, for example, said, "I worked in a government agency and I saw firsthand a hideous level of cronyism and corruption. There was a perversive culture of immunity. You could get away with anything you had done as long as you were on good terms with people at the top. I went to the Maidan on the very first night because the EU deal was the last straw." And of course, you know, other research also shows that in particular police violence against university students brought a lot of people, including women, to the streets. Solidarity with protesters was another major reason for women's engagement in protests, and here I could observe a cross-age difference. As far as older women were concerned, oftentimes they were mobilized by their spouses. When their husbands joined the anti-government protests, they also came along. Among young people, peer pressure, peer influence was more salient. Oftentimes, you know, university students came to the Maidan as a group and then they stayed together. So just an illustration, you know, Bogdana said, I went to the square because my students had gone there and they were in danger and in need of my support. Also, some women brought up the notion of civic duty to explain the engagement in protests. Helena, for example, remarked, "I went there because as a citizen of this country, it is my duty to do everything in my power to improve it, and the Maidan embodied people's hope for that." EU integration was not the most widely mentioned reason for protesting, but of course, some women explicitly brought it up and expressed their disapproval of the attempted reversal of Ukraine's foreign policy. Larissa, for example, said, "I don't want to live in a country like Russia, and the decision to reject the EU deal in favor of Russia was appalling to me. It felt like we were a step away from becoming North Korea." Some women also joined the protests out of the professional duty. They felt like there was a need, for example, for the medical personnel, for counseling, and that's why they joined. Darina, for example, said, "I'm trained as a psychologist. I first went to the Maidan to satisfy my professional curiosity and stayed because I realized I could be of help. My role was very important because people were deeply affected by the events unfolding in front of them." And in general, I think oftentimes scholars don't mention personal curiosity as a reason for joining, but sometimes that's how people get involved in these campaigns. In Ukraine, some women received very conflicting messages what was happening on Maidan. So some of them came out of curiosity, and then once they saw how it was a genuine effort to bring about social change, they stayed. Tatiana, for example, said, "Social media and TV news channels gave conflicting accounts of what was happening. There was no way to sort it out without going to the Maidan and figuring things out for myself." Over the course of this research, we found that very few women, especially at the very beginning, cited gender equality as a primary reason for their involvement in the protest campaign. There were just a handful of women who had prior experience with some women's groups who explicitly said that the main reason why they joined the Euromaidan was to push for gender equality. So Victoria is one of the few who falls into this group. She said, "Women are mothers, but also citizens, and many people can't get into their heads that we can do more than just wipe up snotty noses." So just this is kind of very briefly an overview of different motivations, and I just wanted to provide a few more examples of why women decided to get involved in the Euromaidan, and then I can open the floor to discussion. So just as another illustration of how the notion of motherhood was invoked, Oksana, for example, said that many women, including myself, participated because they understood that we as womankind bear responsibility for our children and our husbands. Women understood that they could do things that are irreplaceable and necessary, even if men did not recognize it. There is a certain maternal instinct in all women, and I think women deeply understand their social role and public needs and perform it, even if they get nothing in return. So, again, that there is this kind of notion of motherhood coming through these comments, and at the same time, an acceptance of the status quo, gender discrimination in Ukrainian society. In some cases, even when women were talking about the EU deal, they still mixed it with their concerns for family relations or family life. So in this long quote, for example, Sophia discusses why the EU deal was important to her, and she mentions the role of the impact on family relations. how migration oftentimes breaks families apart, and you deal by allowing free movement of people would help some families keep in closer contact with each other. You know, that's what she says here. One parent, usually the father, but sometimes the mother, or both, are forced to go abroad and do menial denigrating jobs just to make ends meet. What kind of marriage is it when the father is absent for years at a time? What kind of family is it? More importantly, what do children learn about family relations, love, responsibility? In turn, families like this, it's heartbreaking, it's awful. The EU trade deal would open up a lot of economic prospects for people and possibly alleviate Ukraine's many problems. It would also allow people to visit their families, therefore preserving at least some form of a family unit. I lumped corruption under the rubric of dissatisfaction with the incumbent government when I quoted the responses. Joshua Tucker makes an argument that corruption is was really a critical issue for overcoming collective action problems during the Orange Revolution. And again, you know, outrage over the magnitude of corruption in Ukrainian society came up during the Revolution of Dignity. So this is just another illustration of how discontent with the level of performance, government performance, brought some women into the street. So Yorina said, I come from a small town where corruption is rampant. I could not do anything there because everyone was so corrupt. If you stood up for your rights, someone would come and burn down your house, and the police would do nothing. When I posted a call to go to the Maidan, I responded. I helped out in any way I could. I felt a little bit like a member of the White Guard, except that we were fighting for human rights, for the right to be treated as a human being by our government, rather than fighting for the Tsar. Some women developed actually feminist consciousness over the course of the protest campaign. Initially, when they joined, they might have driven by solidarity with protesters, especially their spouses, but then when they observed the gender-based division of labor inside the encampment, when they were kind of pushed into the kitchens, some of them began to, you know, express the disagreement with this gender discrimination within the revolutionary movement and develop feminist consciousness. So Nadia was one of them. She said that my husband was very much into it, and I felt the need to support him. At first I went because he was there, but he hung out with other men. Men made barricades and other defensive structures. I joined a lot of women who were discussing politics. We had our discussions in the kitchens. When they were wounded, I went on runs to get medical supplies, and my friends and I fought hard for the right not to be sent home. The men tried to tell us that it was not our place, but at that time I believed that it was as much my responsibility to defend my rights as it was my husband's. So we have yet to see how some of these women who found this kind of feminist voice inside them, whether you know, it would have any sort of repercussions on their lives in the post-revolutionary period. Before closing, I also want to mention that the DIF-KISS public opinion poll conducted in the winter of 2013 also asked people inside the encampment, you know, why they participate in protests. And when I looked at the statistics, the results, I could see that our findings are quite consistent with what they have observed on a larger scale. Women in particular mentioned police violence on November 30 as a main reason for their involvement in the campaign. And also they were driven by the desire to change their life in Ukraine and bring about change in the government. There are very few gender differences in terms of the motivations for engagement in protests. A slightly larger percentage of men mentioned revenge for the government as a reason for their involvement, but you know, other than that, by and large, they were motivated by a similar set of factors. And in conclusion, I want to point out that a wide range of factors might motivate women to protest. So it should not be just reduced to the notion of motherhood. Some women were brought into the square by the sense of professional or civic duty, solidarity with the protesters, outrage over government corruption and dismal performance. And I think it's important to look at women's participation in protest events and revolutions to provide a more inclusive portrayal of these processes in Eastern Europe. In the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity, I could not say that dramatic change happened in Ukraine as far as gender equality is concerned. The government appointed just 2 women as ministers, and they were given the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education. So again, here in the distribution of these portfolios, you can see the reinforcement of certain gender stereotypes. And by the way, I think that the Minister of Health is currently in New York City. I think she will be, definitely I know she will be giving a talk at Fordham on Tuesday. So I mean, she can tell a lot about gender discrimination that is happening in the health sector. And in 2016, when parliamentary elections were held, women received just around 12% of seats in parliament. So it was a slight improvement compared to, let's say, 10% or 9% during the previous election, but it was not a dramatic difference. There are some attempts to introduce gender quotas on party lists, but there are mixed responses to these initiatives. And I would like to end on a positive kind of note by quoting Natalia Karborska, chair of Ukrainian Women's Fund, who said that every crisis is an opportunity. Women are now more visible in society, in civil society, politics, journalism, and even as female soldiers. So, you know, they're trying to fight for gender equality in different ways, and we need to conduct more research to understand how greater gender equality can be achieved in contemporary Ukraine.